The Academy's greatest mystery, the morning sun of Nexus Prime, cast long shadows across the crystalline spires of the galaxy's most prestigious military academy. Admiral Korath Vex stood at the observation deck of the Strategic Command Center, his scaled hands clasped behind his back as he watched the assembled cadets below. Today was different. Today, they would witness something that had puzzled military minds for over 3 decades. The Saurian admiral's yellow eyes swept across the crowd of future military leaders. Representatives from 12 different species filled the amphitheater, each bringing their own martial traditions and tactical philosophies. The proud Zenthari, with their forearms crossed in ceremonial poses, their chitinous armor gleaming under the artificial lights. The ethereal Lumians floated slightly above their seats, their translucent forms shimmering with inner light. The massive Gorvani, each one the size of 3 ordinary beings, sat in specially reinforced chairs that creaked under their weight. But today there was something new, something that had the entire academy buzzing with curiosity and skepticism in equal measure. For the first time in the academy's 200-year history, they had a human instructor. Captain Alina Vasquez stood quietly in the instructor's alcove, reviewing her notes on a primitive paper pad. The other instructors had offered her advanced holographic displays and neural interface systems, but she preferred the simplicity of pen and paper. It was a habit that had served her well during her 15 years in Earth's Special Forces, and she saw no reason to change now. The human woman was unremarkable by galactic standards. Average height, lean build, short brown hair pulled back in, a practical ponytail, no natural armor, no enhanced limbs, no obvious physical advantages. Yet something about her calm demeanor had put the other instructors on edge since her arrival 3 weeks ago. Admiral Vex activated the amphitheater's address system, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the vast space. Cadets, instructors, distinguished guests. Today marks the 32nd Annual Strategic Assessment Day, where we examine the most challenging military scenarios in recorded galactic history. The crowd settled into attentive silence. This was the Academy's most prestigious event, where the finest tactical minds would analyze impossible situations and attempt to find solutions that had eluded military strategists for generations. This year, the Admiral continued, we present the legendary scenario known as the Impossible Defense. A massive holographic display materialized above the amphitheater, showing a detailed tactical map. 34 years ago, during the Void War against the Hive Collective, a small defensive force held a critical position against overwhelming odds. The display zoomed in, revealing the tactical situation. A narrow mountain pass, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass side by side. At one end, a small outpost with minimal fortifications. At the other end, an advancing army of hive warriors numbered in the tens of thousands. Cadet Prime Zbaton, a young Montari whose insectoid features twitched with intellectual excitement, raised one of her forearms. Admiral, what were the force ratios in this engagement? Excellent question, Cadet Prime. The Admiral manipulated the display, showing unit compositions. The defensive force consisted of approximately 2 soldiers from various species. The attacking hive force numbered over 50,000 warriors, with full air support and heavy weapons. A collective murmur ran through the crowd. These were impossible odds by any conventional military calculation. The defensive position had limited supplies, no possibility of retreat, and no hope of reinforcement for at least 72 hours. Standard military doctrine suggested the position should have fallen within 6 hours. The admiral paused for dramatic effect. Instead, the defenders held for 4 days until relief forces arrived. The attacking hive army was completely destroyed. The amphitheater erupted in excited discussion. Several Zenthori instructors clicked their mandibles in disbelief. The Lumian delegation pulsed with confused colors, their natural bioluminescence reflecting their emotional state. For 3 decades, Admiral Vex continued, military academies across the galaxy have studied this engagement. The greatest strategic minds of our time have analyzed every aspect of the battle. Not one has successfully explained how such a victory was possible. Professor Thylan, an elderly Zenthori with scarred chitin from his own military service, activated his speaking crystal. Admiral, have we confirmed the accuracy of the battle records? Such ratios seem beyond the realm of possibility. The records have been verified by 7 independent investigation teams. Professor, the evidence is undeniable. What remains is the question of how it was accomplished. Captain Vasquez had been listening quietly, occasionally making notes on her pad. Something about the scenario description had caught her attention, and she found herself smiling slightly. The tactical situation sounded remarkably familiar. Admiral Vex noticed her expression. Captain Vasquez, as our newest instructor, perhaps you would share your initial assessment of this scenario. All eyes turned to the human woman. She stood slowly, her movements casual and relaxed in stark contrast to the formal military bearing of her colleagues. Well, Admiral, I have to say this situation reminds me of something we'd call standard defensive protocol back on Earth. The amphitheater fell silent. Did this human just refer to the galaxy's greatest military mystery as standard protocol? Cadet Prime Zilton's compound eyes focused intently on the human instructor. Captain, could you elaborate on that statement? Vasquez glanced at her notes, then looked up at the tactical display. The force ratio, the terrain, the supply situation. We've seen similar engagements throughout human military history. The specific tactics would depend on available resources and enemy capabilities, but the basic approach would be fairly straightforward. Professor Thylan's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement or disbelief. Captain, with respect, you're suggesting that humans have experienced dealing with 50-to-1 odds as a matter of routine. Not routine, exactly, Vasquez replied thoughtfully, but not unprecedented either. Sometimes you find yourself in a position where retreat isn't an option and surrender isn't acceptable. When that happens, you work with what you have and get creative. The casual way she said, "get creative," sent a ripple of unease through the assembled alien instructors. There was something in her tone that suggested depths of experience they hadn't anticipated. Admiral Vex leaned forward in his chair. Captain, are you saying that Earth's military forces have encountered similar tactical situations? Several times throughout our history, yes. Though usually the odds weren't quite as steep as 50-to-1. She paused, considering. Actually, there was one engagement where a single company held off an entire division for 3 days, but that's probably not a fair comparison since they had prepared positions and air support. The amphitheater buzzed with whispered conversations. The casual way this human discussed impossible military scenarios was deeply unsettling to minds. Trained in conventional warfare, Cadet Commander Brolix, a massive Gorvani, whose species was renowned for their straightforward approach to combat, spoke in his rumbling bass voice. Captain, are you suggesting that human forces regularly engage enemies at overwhelming numerical disadvantages? Vasquez looked up at the Gorvani cadet, noting his skeptical expression. Not regularly, no. But when it happens, we adapt. Human military doctrine emphasizes flexibility and creative problem-solving over rigid adherence to standard tactics. Creative problem-solving, Professor Thailand repeated slowly. Could you provide a specific example? The human instructor was quiet for a moment, apparently choosing her words carefully. There's an ancient battle from Earth's history called Thermopylae. 300 soldiers held a narrow pass against an army of hundreds of thousands. They used the terrain, the enemy's overconfidence, and some creative tactics to hold their position far longer than anyone thought possible. Asterisk. What was the outcome? Admiral Vex asked, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. They held long enough for their nation to mobilize its full military response. The invasion failed. Vasquez looked around the amphitheater, noting the expressions of her audience. But that's just one example. Human history is full of situations where small forces achieved disproportionate results through unconventional thinking. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Admiral Vex spoke again. Captain, would you be willing to demonstrate these unconventional tactics using our combat simulation systems? Vasquez considered the request. She had been hoping to ease into her new role gradually, but it seemed the Academy was ready for a more direct introduction to human military thinking. I'd be happy to, Admiral. Though I should warn you, human tactical doctrine can be somewhat intense for species that haven't encountered it before. Admiral Vex exchanged glances with his fellow instructors. The warning in the human's voice was unmistakable, but their curiosity had been thoroughly aroused. Very well, Captain. Tomorrow we will reconvene with the Academy's full holographic combat simulator active. You will have the opportunity to show us how humans approach the impossible. As the assembly began to disperse, excited conversations erupted throughout the amphitheater. Cadets and instructors alike speculated about what they might witness. The following day, Captain Vasquez remained in her alcove, making additional notes on her pad. She was already planning the demonstration, and part of her wondered if the galaxy was truly ready to understand how humans approached warfare. The question that had started as simple curiosity was about to reveal something that would fundamentally change how every species in the galaxy thought about military strategy, tactical flexibility, and the very nature of what was possible in combat. Tomorrow, the Academy would learn why humans had never encountered a truly impossible military situation. Asterisk, the demonstration that shook the galaxy the following morning brought unprecedented attendance to the Academy's primary simulation chamber. Word had spread through the galactic military community overnight, and observers had arrived from dozens of worlds. The chamber itself was a marvel of technology, capable of creating completely realistic holographic environments indistinguishable from actual combat situations. Admiral Vex stood before the assembled crowd, his scaled features showing signs of a sleepless night spent reviewing human military records. What his research teams had uncovered had left him both fascinated and deeply concerned. Before we begin today's demonstration, the Admiral announced, I must share some disturbing information that came to light during our overnight analysis of Earth's military history. The amphitheater fell silent. Captain Vasquez, standing calmly beside the simulation controls, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Our research indicates that the scenario we presented yesterday as the impossible defense bears striking similarity to no fewer than 17 documented battles from Earth's military history. In several cases, the human forces faced even worse odds and still achieved victory. A collective intake of breath echoed through the chamber. Cadet Prime Zilton's compound eyes widened to their maximum aperture, a sure sign of extreme surprise among her species. Furthermore, Admiral Vex continued, we discovered that the actual historical engagement that inspired our theoretical scenario was witnessed and documented by a human military observer who was present during the Void War. Captain, would you care to comment? Vasquez nodded slowly. Major Patricia Schum, Earth Expeditionary Force. She was part of the initial diplomatic contact team and remained as a military liaison. Her reports on the engagement were ... detailed. Professor Thylan activated his speaking crystal. Captain, are you saying that a human observer was present during the battle we've been studying for 30 years? Present and providing tactical advice to the defensive commander, yes. Major Chen had experience with similar situations from Earth's military history. She recommended what we would consider standard defensive tactics for that type of engagement. Implications hit the assembled crowd like a physical force. Their greatest military mystery had been solved by applying routine human tactical doctrine. Admiral Vex gestured toward the simulation chamber. Captain, if you would proceed with your demonstration. Vasquez stepped into the control alcove and began configuring the simulation parameters. I'm going to recreate the original scenario, but I'll add some context that might help explain the human approach to these situations. The chamber filled with a perfect holographic recreation of the mountain pass from the original battle. Rocky walls rose on either side, creating a natural bottleneck that could be defended by a relatively small force. At the narrow end of the pass, she placed a small outpost with basic fortifications. Standard galactic military doctrine would focus on the obvious defensive advantages of this position, Vasquez explained as she worked. High ground, limited approach routes, established fortifications. But humans would also immediately identify several additional factors. She manipulated the simulation, highlighting various terrain features. These loose rocks could be turned into improvised weapons. The narrow walls would create acoustic amplification, useful for psychological warfare. These shadows could conceal movement and create confusion about actual force, strength. Cadet Commander Brolax rumbled his confusion. Captain, those seem like minor tactical considerations. How could they affect the outcome against such overwhelming odds? Vasquez smiled, and several observers noted that the expression didn't reach her eyes. That's where human military thinking differs from galactic standard doctrine. We don't see individual tactical elements as minor considerations. We see them as pieces of a larger strategic puzzle. She activated the simulation, and the chamber, filled with the sounds and sights of approaching enemy forces. Thousands of holographic hive warriors advanced through the pass, their chittering calls echoing off the rocky walls. Standard defensive tactics would involve establishing firing positions, maximizing firepower, and hoping to inflict enough casualties to discourage the attack. Vasquez narrated as the simulation played out. Human tactics would add several additional layers. The holographic defenders began implementing tactics that left the observers stunned. Small teams moved constantly, firing from different positions to create the illusion of larger numbers. Improvised explosive devices, crafted from available materials, created confusion and psychological pressure. Most disturbing of all, the defenders seemed to be targeting specific individuals within the attacking force. Captain, Admiral Vex called out, are your forces targeting the enemy command structure? Among other things, yes. Humans learned long ago that disrupting enemy leadership and communication creates exponential tactical advantages. But we're also targeting what my species calls force multipliers. The simulation continued, showing human defenders using everything, from carefully placed rockfalls to sophisticated psychological operations. The attacking force, despite overwhelming numerical superiority, began showing signs of confusion and declining morale. Asterisk, asterisk. Professor Thylin watched in fascination as a small team of defenders managed to convince an entire wing of the attacking force that they were surrounded by much larger numbers. How is this possible? The enemy has direct visual confirmation of defender positions. Humans have extensive experience with what we call asymmetric warfare, Vasquez explained. When you're outnumbered, you don't fight the enemy's strengths. You create new battlefield conditions that favor your capabilities. The simulation reached its climax as the massive attacking force began to falter. Despite their overwhelming numbers, they found themselves confused, demoralized, and unable to effectively coordinate their assault. Individual units began falling back, and the retreat soon became a rout. The amphitheater fell into stunned silence as the simulation ended. The impossible defense had been achieved using tactics that seemed almost mundane when explained, but devastating when implemented. Admiral Vex found his voice first. Captain, you've just demonstrated that what we considered our greatest military mystery was actually a routine application of human tactical doctrine. Not routine, Vasquez corrected gently, but certainly not unprecedented. Humans have been fighting against impossible odds for our entire recorded history. We've learned that impossible usually just means nobody's tried the right approach yet. Cadet Prime Zilton raised one of her 4 arms. Captain, what makes humans capable of this type of thinking? Other species have faced desperate situations, but none have developed these capabilities. Vasquez considered the question carefully. I think it comes down to how we define acceptable outcomes. Most species, when faced with overwhelming odds, focus on minimizing losses or negotiating surrender. Humans tend to focus on how to win anyway. But surely there must be situations even humans consider truly impossible, Professor Thylin insisted. The human instructor was quiet for a long moment. Professor, I've been in combat for 15 years. I've seen humans achieve things that violated every principle of military science. I've learned that the only truly impossible situation is the one where you stop trying to find a solution. Admiral Vex stood slowly, his expression thoughtful. Captain, this demonstration has raised profound questions about military education and tactical doctrine throughout the galaxy. I believe a formal review of our curriculum is in order. Admiral Vasquez replied, I'd be happy to help develop new training programs. But I should warn you, human tactical doctrine isn't just about specific techniques. It's about fundamentally changing how you approach problems that seem unsolvable. The assembled crowd began discussing the implications among themselves. Representatives from various military academies were already planning to request human instructors for their own institutions. As the formal session concluded, Admiral Vex approached Captain Vasquez privately. Captain, I must ask you directly, are there other aspects of human military capability that we should be aware of? Vasquez looked at the Saurian admiral with an expression that was both amused and sympathetic. Admiral, what you've seen today represents basic human defensive tactics. We haven't even touched on offensive operations, special warfare, or strategic planning. The admiral's scales shifted to a slightly paler shade, a sign of deep concern among his species. Perhaps we should schedule additional demonstrations. I think that would be wise, Vasquez agreed. The galaxy is about to learn that. Humans don't just make good allies because we're friendly. We make good allies because we're very, very good at winning wars. As the crowds dispersed and the simulation chamber powered down, one truth became clear to everyone present. The question that had seemed so simple the day before had revealed something that would reshape military thinking throughout the galaxy. Humans hadn't just solved the impossible defense scenario, they had demonstrated that for them. There was no such thing as an impossible defense at all. The Academy's greatest mystery had been solved, but in its place arose a new understanding that would change everything. The galaxy had found not just new allies, but teachers who could show them that the word impossible was simply a challenge waiting for the right approach. And somewhere in the back of everyone's mind was the unsettling realization that if this was how humans approached defense, they were very curious to see what human offensive capabilities looked like, but that perhaps was a demonstration for another day. Asterisk.